The air smells like iron and hot dust. In front of you is a wall, not stone, not wood, a wall of men, shields, and steel, and above all, spears. Thousands of spearheads, all pointed at you, all moving at the same time. 6 meters of polished ashwood and iron sarissas stacked in layers, 5 ranks deep, like the teeth of a giant animal. This is the Macedonian phalanx, the machine that carried Alexander the Great across the world, the formation that made kings feel small, the system that taught entire civilizations a single lesson. You don't beat this. You endure it until you can't. And now it's coming toward you, relentless, quiet, perfect. A century and a half of fear walks forward in one synchronized step. If you were Persian, you'd remember Gaugamela. If you were Greek, you'd remember Chaeronea. If you were Egyptian, you'd remember the moment your world accepted that resistance was cosmetic. But you're not any of them. You're Ramon, a farmer, a blacksmith, a citizen who learned discipline not from philosophy, but from hunger and from being cornered by enemies who wanted him dead. And while the rest of the Mediterranean looks at the phalanx and sees invincibility, Rome looks at it and sees something else. A beast with a blind spot. At first, the old story begins again. The phalanx pushes. The Romans give ground. The wall of spear points advances, and the space to breathe shrinks into a memory. Men die before they can even touch their enemy. The front ranks are pinned in place by a forest of iron they can't cut fast enough. Somewhere on a nearby rise stands Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an aging Roman aristocrat, not famous for charm or theatrics, but for method. And according to ancient historians, he feels a chill. Not the chill of cowardice, the chill of recognition. That moment where you realize something you respected from a distance is now close enough to kill you. Because for a few minutes, Rome looks like it might be swallowed. And if the story ended there, history would sound different today. But then, the unthinkable happens. Not a heroic charge, not a divine miracle, just terrain, uneven ground, a slight rise, a shallow dip, a place where perfect geometry meets the real world, and the perfect machine begins to fail. A small gap opens in the wall of spears, then another. To the Macedonians, inside the formation, it feels like a minor inconvenience. To the Romans watching from outside, it feels like an invitation. This is where history splits, because this is not just Rome versus Macedonia. It is rigid perfection versus controlled adaptability. It is centralized order versus local initiative. It is the philosophy of a king who wants his army to move like a single weapon, against the philosophy of a republic that learned to survive by letting its soldiers think inside the plan. And in a single afternoon at Pydna, Alexander's most famous inheritance becomes obsolete. Not because the Romans were braver, not because their steel was better, but because their mentality was. To understand how that happened, how the longest spear in the ancient world lost to the shortest sword, we have to go back to the moment the phalanx was born. Back before the empire, back before Alexander, back when Macedonia was a joke. A northern kingdom the polished Greeks barely considered civilized. A place of rough tribes and rougher politics. A place that seemed permanently unstable, too poor to dominate, too divided to last. Until one man came home from captivity with an idea. Philip II. He didn't return to a throne. He returned to a funeral. His brother dead, the borders threatened, the nobles plotting, the treasury thin, a kingdom collapsing in slow motion. And Philip did what desperate, intelligent men do. He stopped thinking like everyone else. He didn't try to out-Greek the Greeks. He didn't try to build a citizen militia like Athens or a warrior caste like Sparta. He built something colder, a professional instrument, a machine. He took the traditional spear short, manageable, and made it absurd. 6 meters long, too long to use with one hand. So the soldiers had to use both hands, which meant they couldn't carry the large round shield of the Greek hoplite. So Philip reduced the shield, hung it from the neck or shoulder, made the soldier part of a system rather than an individual. And then he organized those soldiers into a formation so dense, so disciplined, so unified, that an enemy would have to overcome multiple spear points before reaching the first body. 6 meters of reach, 6 meters of denial. The phalanx didn't just threaten you. It denied you access to the fight itself. It turned battle into a physics problem the enemy couldn't solve. And Philip trained them like professionals, not seasonal. Farmers, not summer warriors who wanted to go home. Men who marched in winter. Men who carried their own gear. Men whose identity wasn't citizen first and soldier second. For them, the phalanx wasn't a tactic. It was a life. When Philip's phalanx met the traditional Greek hoplite line, the psychological effect was immediate. The hoplite's courage didn't disappear. It simply became irrelevant. A brave man is still brave while he bleeds out 6 feet away from the enemy he cannot reach. The phalanx made heroism feel childish. And with that, Philip forced Greece into a new reality. A reality where unity, discipline, and reach beat tradition. Then Philip died, and his son inherited the machine. Alexander didn't invent the phalanx. He weaponized it on a global scale. With the phalanx as an anvil and cavalry as the hammer, he broke armies that were larger, richer, and older than his kingdom. Persia fell. Egypt folded. Babylon opened its gates. The phalanx became more than a formation. It became a myth, a symbol of inevitability. And myths have a strange effect on the people who inherit them. They stop asking if it still works. They start believing it must. That belief that inheritance equals superiority was one of Macedonia's most dangerous addictions. Because every perfect machine carries a hidden weakness. Not because its makers are foolish, because perfection has a price. In this case, the price was dependency. Dependency on cohesion. Dependency on flat terrain. Dependency on maintaining a clean front. The phalanx was devastating when it was whole, but it was helpless when it was broken. And that is exactly the kind of weakness Rome was born to exploit. Rome did not create its army through genius. It created its army through humiliation. Rome lost to mountain tribes. Rome was outmaneuvered. Rome was ambushed. Rome suffered disasters that would have ended other states. And each time, Rome did something that sounds simple, but is rare in human behavior. It adapted without ego. It treated defeat like instruction, not like an insult. That mindset, pragmatic, unsentimental, shaped everything about the Roman legion. Rome's weapons weren't elegant. They weren't heroic. They were efficient. The scutum, large, curved, like a portable door, was not just a shield. It was a tool for forcing space in a crowded fight. It could slam into a man, unbalance him, create an opening. Then came the pilum, a heavy javelin thrown before contact, designed not just to wound, but to sabotage. Ancient sources describe pila that could bend or become awkward to remove. Whether every pilum behaved exactly like that is debated by modern specialists, but the intent is clear. Disrupt the enemy's protection and cohesion. A shield with something heavy lodged in it becomes a liability. A soldier who drops his shield becomes a target. A line that was clean becomes uneven. And unevenness is where Rome lived. Then came the gladius. Short, plain, ruthless. Not a weapon made for wide swings or cinematic duels. A weapon made for close work, stabbing in tight spaces. The kind of fight that happens when men are too close to swing. Rome understood something brutal about combat. Most killing happens at arm's length, not in poetry, in pressure. And Rome's organization supported that reality. The legion was not a single block like the phalanx. It was modular. It was divided into smaller units that could move, adjust, and respond. In the older manipular system, those units formed a pattern with gaps, allowing for movement, reinforcement, and tactical breathing. Even as Roman organization evolved over time, the principle remained: flexibility, local initiative, and the ability to fight in broken terrain. And at the center of that system stood the centurion, not a king, not always, a noble, a professional, a man whose authority came from experience and enforcement. He didn't command from behind like an ornament. He commanded near the front, where he could see what was actually happening. And that meant the Roman army didn't require perfection to function. It required discipline and then permission to improvise within it. That difference is subtle until the moment it isn't. For decades, these two worlds dominated separate spheres. Macedonia and the Hellenistic kingdoms looked east and south. Rome looked west, then north, then everywhere. The Mediterranean got smaller, and eventually the longest spear met the shortest sword. By the mid-2nd century BC, Alexander's empire was already history. His successors ruled fragments wealthy, cultured, but suspicious and divided. Macedonia remained proud, but it was no longer the unstoppable force of Philip and Alexander's era. On the Macedonian throne sat Perseus, not a genius like Philip, not a comet like Alexander, but still a king holding a dangerous inheritance. The phalanx was his identity, his proof, his legitimacy. And Rome's rise felt like an insult to the very idea of Hellenic superiority. So Perseus gathered allies, stirred resistance, promised Greek cities a